Marana YouTube channel. Today we will be discussing about thrust bearing. So let's move in detail. Thrust from the propeller is taken up by the main thrust bearing. Okay, from the propeller, thrust is taken up by main thrust bearing. The main thrust bearing will transmit thrust to the ship hull and cause the ship to be propelled in the direction of thrust. Okay, thrust from the propeller is taken up by main thrust bearing, and main thrust bearing will transmit thrust to the ship hull and cause the ship to be propelled in the direction of thrust. Thrust bearing is always fitted at the aft end of main engine crankshaft. Usually, in every time, always fitted aft end of main engine crankshaft, because the main thrust bearing controls the correct location of the crank pins related to center of cylinder. The main thrust bearing, they have to control the correct location of crank pin related to center of cylinder. Okay, the thrust bearing, it is always fitted at the aft end of main engine crankshaft, and main thrust bearing, it controls the correct location of crank pin related to center of cylinders. In main propulsion machinery, thrust bearing most commonly used is tilting pad type. Most commonly used thrust bearing is tilting pad type. In tilting pad type bearing, a thrust collar is forged integrally with a thrust shaft. In a tilting pad type bearing, a thrust collar is forged integrally with thrust shaft. On the forward and aft side of thrust collar, the thrust pads are fitted. On the forward and aft side of thrust collar, the thrust pads are fitted. Okay, the thrust pads are lined with a white metal and face onto a finely machined polished surface of the thrust collar. The thrust pads are usually lined with a white metal and face onto a finely machined and polished surface of thrust collar. The back of the pad has a radial ridges which forms fulcrum on which pad can tilt. The back of the pad has a radial ridges which form fulcrum on which pad can tilt. The tilting fulcrum on the back of pad, it come in contact with solidly constructed housing. The tilting fulcrum on the back of pad come in contact with solidly constructed housing, and housing is rigidly held in the thrust bearing casing, and this housing is rigidly held in the thrust bearing casing. Okay, the thrust pads are lined with white metal and face to a finely machined and polished surface of the thrust collar. The back of pad has a radial ridges and which will form fulcrum on which pad can tilt. The tilting fulcrum on the back of the pad, it come in contact with solidly constructed housing, and this housing is rigidly held in thrust bearing casing. And this type of bearing build up an oil pressure between the white metal face and a thrust pad. This will build up an oil pressure between the white metal face and thrust pad and thrust collar when the shaft revolves. When the shaft revolves, this will build up an oil pressure between the white metal face and the thrust pad. Oil pressure is due to formation of oil wedge. Oil pressure is mainly due to formation of oil wedge, which can build up only when thrust collar is supplied with the oil and is revolving. Oil wedge. This will oil pressure will form due to formation of an oil wedge, which can build up only when thrust collar is supplied. As the pad is able to tilt, it becomes self-adjusting to the shape of wedge. So this tilting pad is self-adjusting. So it will adjust tilt to become the self-adjusting to the shape of the wedge. Okay, this type of bearing builds up an oil pressure between the white metal face and thrust pad as the shaft revolves. So oil pressure is here formed due to formation of oil wedge, which can build up only when the thrust collar is supplied with oil and is revolving. Okay, as the thrust pad is able to tilt, it becomes self-adjusting to the shape of the wedge. And the thrust acting on the thrust collar is balanced by oil pressure created by the tilting pad, and thus transmitting the thrust to ship hull via tilting pad housing. Here, the thrust acting on the thrust collar, it is balanced by oil pressure that created by the tilting pad, and thus transmitting the thrust to ship hull via tilting pad housing. Okay, the radial ridge on the back of the pad, which becomes fulcrum for the tilting action, is often made off center. Okay, the radial ridge on the back of tilting pad will act as a fulcrum for the tilting action, which is often made off center. If the thrust pads are viewed from the top, the tilting point is always from the center moving in the direction of rotation of collar. If the thrust pads are, if you view the thrust pad from the top view, then tilting pad is always from the center moving in the direction of rotation of collar. Always moves from the center moving in direction of rotation of collar. Here this picture of a thrust pad, and there will be thrust ring. Thrust pad will be there. Tilting pad is shown is tilting pad, line of pivot, and here's thrust pad collar, thrust bearing and all. This here thrust pad uses tilting pad type thrust bearing. Thank you.